Barron Trump interrupts a live broadcast to defend Melania. His words leave everyone speechless. Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump, has made a stunning move that has caught the attention of the nation. After years of living under the intense scrutiny of the public eye, Barron has decided to take control of his own narrative. In a bold statement that has left both supporters and critics alike in shock, Barron is stepping out of the shadows and redefining his place in the world. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest updates on this breaking news. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The night had a calm, almost unnerving stillness about it as the camera panned across the set of CNN Tonight with Anderson Cooper. The show, which typically maintained a tone of somber professionalism, was tackling a highly controversial subject that evening. Anderson, the ever-composed anchor, sat at the center of the stage, preparing for what should have been a routine segment. But there was a palpable sense of tension in the studio, a sense that this conversation, once initiated, would spiral beyond anyone's control. It was not unusual for the media to scrutinize public figures. In fact, it was expected. But tonight's subject was one of the most high-profile figures in America, and the conversation was set to delve into deeply personal territories. The topic, Melania Trump, a former First Lady, a woman constantly in the spotlight, and most recently, one who had chosen to attend a charity event dressed in an extravagant red gown, a gown that was now the subject of sharp commentary. The camera zoomed in on Anderson Cooper as he prepared to introduce the segment, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the show's graphic flashed a striking headline, Melania Trump's Fashion Choices, a Statement of Elegance or Arrogance. His voice was smooth, but there was a subtle edge, as though he was preparing for something he couldn't yet predict. "Good evening," Anderson began, his voice setting the tone for what was to come. "Tonight, we're focusing on the former First Lady's recent public appearance at a charity event, where she wore a highly publicized, eye-catching red dress. While the event was meant to raise awareness for an important cause, the optics of Melania Trump's fashion choices have stirred some controversy." As he spoke, the camera cut to a close-up of Maria Cardona, one of the regular political analysts on the show, her face tight with disapproval. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes flicking toward Anderson before she began to speak. Melania Trump, once again, seems more focused on maintaining an image of opulence than actually engaging with the causes she claims to care about, Maria said, her voice sharp. The choice of a lavish gown, accessorized with diamonds, seems out of touch with the reality many Americans are living in right now. Is this what we should expect from someone who once presented herself as a champion for children? Anderson nodded in agreement, and for a brief moment, the conversation shifted to politics. They discussed Melania's tenure as First Lady, her various initiatives, and the contradictions that had often accompanied her public persona. But the discussion inevitably turned back to her appearance, the dress, the diamonds, the choice of public charity. While some might argue that Melania's fashion is a personal choice, there's no denying that the way she presents herself sends a message. David Gergen, the veteran political analyst, chimed in. His voice was steady, measured, and in this case, it appears to be a message of disconnect. There's a growing perception that she is more interested in being a celebrity than a figure who can actually affect change. The word stung. The tone was as sharp as a cutting remark, though it appeared to be masked under the guise of political analysis. The criticisms continued, veering toward the personal. "And let's not forget the dynamic of her marriage to Donald Trump," Maria added, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The media has long speculated about the nature of their relationship. Some say it's more of a business arrangement than a marriage. She stands by him at these events. But does she truly stand for anything more than his brand?" There was a brief pause. The air in the studio seemed to thicken with the weight of the questions left hanging in the space between them. Anderson leaned forward, his tone now more measured. "It's not unusual for public figures to be scrutinized, especially when they hold such significant positions," he said, his voice becoming more neutral. But with Melania Trump, there's often a disconnect between the woman we see on the outside and the persona that's projected by the media. Some see her as a symbol of grace, while others see her as a symbol of excess. As the conversation continued, the comments became more biting. It was clear that Melania was being painted not just as a public figure, but as the embodiment of all that was perceived to be wrong with wealth, privilege, and power. The narrative was becoming personal, reducing her to little more than a set of clothes and a face that the media loved to dissect. At that moment, as though the conversation had become too much for him to ignore, a soft, almost imperceptible noise could be heard behind the set. The sound of the studio doors opening. The camera zoomed out, the angle shifting, and suddenly Barron Trump, tall, quiet and calm, was seen walking across the stage toward the anchor desk. It was a sight that immediately threw the live broadcast off course. Barron Trump, the son of the former president, was not a figure typically seen on television, certainly not in the same way his parents had been. He had remained largely out of the public eye, away from the controversies that surrounded his family. Yet here he was, stepping into the spotlight in a moment no one could have anticipated. For a moment, the entire studio seemed to stop. Maria and David blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected interruption. Anderson Cooper, whose poise usually remained unshaken, shifted in his seat, his eyebrows raising in surprise. The audience at home, who had been following the show closely, probably felt their own shock reverberate through the airwaves. Barron's entrance was silent, but powerful. His tall frame, dressed in a sharp navy suit, seemed at odds with the casual conversational tone of the broadcast. He didn't appear nervous or out of place. Instead, he looked calm, poised, almost as though he were in control of the moment. Anderson, still recovering from the surprise, managed to find his voice. Barron, is everything all right?" he asked, a faint note of uncertainty in his tone. Barron didn't waste a second. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the hosts, the camera, and the audience with an unspoken intensity. "Actually, I think you've gone too far," he said, his voice clear, calm, but commanding. The words were simple, yet they felt like an unexpected storm breaking. The studio fell into complete silence. The tension in the air, which had been simmering ever since the conversation began, now reached a boiling point. Barron, the young son of one of the most controversial families in American politics, had just made his presence felt in a way no one could ignore. The camera shifted slightly, capturing the stunned expressions of Maria and David. Their mouths parted in disbelief. Anderson, who had always handled difficult situations with grace, now found himself at a loss for words. He wasn't sure how to respond. Barron didn't seem to mind. He continued, his eyes locking with the camera now, as if addressing not just the hosts, but the entire world watching. "You're mocking my mother for doing something she believes in," Barron continued, his voice unwavering. "You've reduced her to a joke, as though the only thing she stands for is her appearance or her marriage. That's not who she is, and it's time someone stood up and said it." Each word Barron spoke seemed to carry the weight of something larger than the moment. The studio remained dead silent, and for the first time that evening, the audience at home could feel a shift in the narrative. Barron wasn't just defending his mother, he was making a statement that had nothing to do with Melania Trump's gown or her accessories. It was about respect. It was about the narrative that the media had constructed for her, and how deeply flawed that narrative had become. "She's more than the picture you want to paint of her," Barron finished, his voice firm. "She deserves more than this." And with that, Barron turned and walked off the stage. The room stayed still for a moment longer. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to process what had just happened. Anderson Cooper, ever the professional, cleared his throat, but it was evident that the broadcast had taken an unexpected turn. What was supposed to be a carefully planned, composed discussion about a public figure had now been overshadowed by a teenager's interruption. A teenager who had just used his voice to challenge everything the media had assumed about his family. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Anderson spoke, but his voice was subdued. "Well, that was certainly unexpected." The words hung in the air as the camera cut to a commercial break, and as the show went dark for a brief moment, the world outside was left reeling, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The studio lights dimmed briefly as the broadcast cut to a commercial break, offering everyone a moment to collect themselves. Anderson Cooper, now sitting in front of the camera, took a deep breath. His composed face was still visible, but there was an unmistakable flicker of surprise in his eyes, the kind that even a seasoned professional like him couldn't fully conceal. The immediate chaos in the control room behind the set could not be seen by the audience, but it was tangible to those inside the studio. Producers, camera operators, and sound technicians exchanged hurried words over the intercom, their voices too fast to follow, but unmistakably urgent. There was an unsettling sense of unpredictability in the air, as if the carefully orchestrated flow of the show had been completely upended. What had just happened? Who had authorized Barron Trump to appear on set? And what now? Inside the green room, the team was in disarray. Maria Cardona, who had been vocal in her criticism of Melania, was still sitting in her chair, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her lips were pressed together, tight, her hands clenched in her lap, as though trying to regain some semblance of control. She had been a part of the conversation, part of the very narrative that Barron had so publicly rejected. Now she found herself caught in the aftermath, wondering how she could possibly move forward. How could she defend her earlier remarks about Melania when the son of the former president had just stood up and challenged the entire structure of the broadcast? David Gergen, too, was lost in thought. He had spent decades in politics and the media, guiding high-profile figures, advising presidents, and analyzing the nation's most important events. But this was different. Barron Trump had just inserted himself into the conversation, not with the chaos and bombast typical of his family, but with a quiet, deliberate command. And his words had been sharp, like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through the carefully constructed narratives the media had worked so hard to build. David glanced over at Maria. "We need to regroup," he murmured, his voice low, his tone heavy with the weight of the moment. Maria looked up slowly, her gaze flickering with the realization that this was no longer about a dress or the optics of Melania's charity event. It was about something deeper, something more unsettling. Barron wasn't just defending his mother, he had exposed a deeper, darker side of the media. His calmness, his control, it was clear he knew exactly what he was doing. Barron Trump had just put the media in a place where they had to rethink their own actions, where their judgments and assumptions were suddenly under intense scrutiny. As the commercial break ended, the show's producers quickly tried to regain composure, but there was no denying that Barron Trump had already won the attention of the audience. The broadcast continued, but the momentum had shifted. Online, the storm was just beginning. Social media exploded almost immediately. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook were flooded with reactions. Thousands of tweets and posts were shared, dissecting every word Barron had said. Some hailed him as a hero, defending his mother in the face of media bias. Others expressed skepticism, wondering if this was simply another carefully orchestrated move in a larger political strategy. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that Barron had made an indelible mark. The hashtags #Barron Trump and Defend Melania trended worldwide. Barron's name, once whispered only in the background, now dominated the digital landscape. For those who had criticized the Trump family for years, it was jarring to see their own words turned back on them in such a public and powerful way. Television commentators picked up the story within minutes. On cable news, panels of pundits debated the implications of Barron's interruption, speculating on whether it was a calculated political maneuver or a sincere outburst of emotion. Some saw it as a strategic move by the Trump family to regain control of their public image. Others, however, saw it as a moment of real personal defense, a young son standing up for his mother in a world that seemed intent on tearing her down. Meanwhile, Barron's social media presence, which had previously been non-existent, was suddenly flooded with messages of support and disdain. People who had never known or cared about Barron Trump now found themselves drawn into his world. News outlets scrambled to uncover everything they could about the young man who had just upended an entire national conversation. Back in the CNN Tonight control room, the pressure was mounting. There were calls coming in from every direction. The higher-ups at the network were demanding answers. How could this have happened? Was Barron's appearance planned? Was he supposed to speak? And if not, who had allowed him to speak so freely? The producers were whispering furiously into their headsets, trying to make sense of the situation. A few quick phone calls revealed that Barron's appearance had not been scheduled. He wasn't a guest. He hadn't been prepped for the broadcast. He had walked onto the set without anyone's prior approval, seizing control of a live high-stakes broadcast without so much as a hint of hesitation. "This is a mess," one of the senior producers muttered under their breath. "What are we going to do now?" In the midst of the chaos, Anderson Cooper sat quietly in the studio, staring at the camera as the credits for the commercial break began to roll. His calm composure seemed almost out of place now, but the words Barron had spoken, the words that had shaken the room, were still echoing in his mind. It wasn't just Barron's defense of his mother that had stood out. It was the control he had shown, the clarity in his voice, the way he had turned the tables on the entire media establishment in one brief but powerful moment. Cooper had seen many things in his career, from political scandals to personal confrontations, but this was something different. Barron Trump wasn't just a bystander. He had emerged as a force in his own right. In a private corner of the Trump Tower, far from the media frenzy, Barron sat quietly with his father, Donald Trump, in a small, dimly lit room. The meeting had been planned in advance, though no one had known the timing. No one had known what Barron would do or say on CNN Tonight, but his actions were part of a larger strategy, one that had been in the works for some time. Donald Trump leaned back in his chair, watching Barron carefully. The teen was sitting across from him, calm and composed, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. Donald could see the change in his son. Barron was no longer just a kid who had been sheltered from the public eye. He was growing into someone with his own sense of purpose, someone who understood the dynamics of the world around him far more than anyone had given him credit for. "You did well," Donald said, his voice low but approving. "You made your point. You showed them who you are, but you know this is just the beginning, right? They'll try to tear you down now." Barron didn't flinch. "I'm not worried. I meant what I said. They've had enough of my mother. It's time they learned who they're dealing with." Donald smiled, a touch of pride in his expression. "Exactly. They won't know what hit them. Keep your head steady. The game has just started." It was clear now. Barron wasn't just defending his mother. He was asserting himself in a larger battle, a battle for control of his family's image, and perhaps even his own future. As father and son sat in the quiet, their world was shifting, and with every move they made, the ground under the media's feet was beginning to shake. Barron had made his statement, and the world was watching to see how far the ripples would spread. Back at CNN, the story continued to evolve. What had started as a simple commentary on Melania Trump's public appearance had now become a political chess match. The media, which had once reveled in the Trump family's scandals and controversies, was now facing an unexpected adversary. Barron Trump had stepped into the ring, and he wasn't going to leave quietly. The broadcast ended with more questions than answers. Cooper and the analysts struggled to regain the conversational flow, but nothing could erase the moment. The damage was done. Barron Trump had made sure of that. And with his final words, his defense of Melania, and his bold assertion of power, he had sent a message. The media may have underestimated him, but it wouldn't happen again. The battle had just begun, and Barron Trump, in his own quiet, calculated way, was ready to fight. The fallout from Barron Trump's unexpected interruption continued to reverberate long after CNN Tonight had aired. What had started as an ordinary night of political analysis had quickly escalated into something that felt far beyond the usual boundaries of media spectacle. Across television screens, in living rooms, and in offices worldwide, Barron's face was now as familiar as any political figure. News outlets, desperate for any semblance of control, attempted to frame the moment in the context of a larger narrative. Some argued it was an emotional outburst, a rare glimpse into the personal dynamics of the Trump family. Others saw it as a masterstroke of media manipulation, an orchestrated performance designed to shift the public's focus back to Melania and the Trump family's brand. The debate was endless, but one thing was clear: Barron Trump had taken the narrative into his own hands, and there was no easy way for the media to undo the damage. The next morning, the national conversation was dominated by speculation and analysis. News shows, radio hosts, and political pundits dissected Barron's words as though they were written into the annals of history. On every news station, from MSNBC to Fox News, Barron's appearance was the main story. Yet the perspectives on what had transpired were as divided as the country itself. On Fox Friends, the hosts applauded Barron for his maturity. "The kid's got backbone," one of the hosts said, clearly impressed by Barron's poise and the clarity of his defense. "He stepped in when his mother was being unfairly attacked. That's something you don't see every day." But on The View, the reactions were more nuanced. "I'm not sure how I feel about this," Whoopi Goldberg remarked, her voice steady, but her face filled with contemplation. "It's one thing for a child to stand up for his parent, but there's something more going on here. This wasn't just a kid protecting his mom. This was a carefully calculated move. And I think that's what's bothering people." The conversation quickly became a tug-of-war between public sympathy and suspicion. Was Barron a young man defending his mother with all the sincerity of a child who had grown up in the glare of the media spotlight? Or was he another cog in a well-oiled political machine, trained and groomed to wield power in a way far beyond his years? Meanwhile, inside Trump Tower, the world outside was nothing more than a blur. Barron had retreated into his own world, away from the prying eyes of the media, leaving his parents to handle the escalating storm. Donald Trump, ever the strategist, took the opportunity to regroup, quietly positioning his family to capitalize on Barron's unexpected rise. Barron spent his days in his room, processing what had happened, replaying the moments of the broadcast in his mind. He had known what he was doing, of course. The weight of his words had not escaped him. But as he sat alone, there was a moment of doubt that crept into his mind. The world now knew him, but was that a good thing? He had interrupted a live broadcast, disrupted a national conversation. What would be the consequence? What would the media do with him next? As Barron pondered these questions, his parents were in constant communication, receiving updates from their advisors and handlers. They knew the media would not let this go easily. The Trump family had always been the subject of scrutiny, but now Barron was the subject, and that meant new challenges. His public defense of Melania had placed him squarely in the media spotlight, and the question remained, how would he handle the glare of it? Donald Trump, ever the confident patriarch, had his own thoughts. He knew his son was capable of far more than anyone realized. The world had always underestimated Barron, his quiet demeanor, his reserved nature, his avoidance of the limelight. But Donald knew better. Barron wasn't like the rest of the Trump family, but that didn't make him any less dangerous. If anything, it gave him an edge. Where his father had used bombast and grand gestures, Barron could move with subtlety and precision, and that, Donald believed, was far more powerful. For the American public, the reactions were mixed. On one side, Barron's supporters saw him as a beacon of courage. "Finally, a member of the Trump family who isn't afraid to speak out for what's right," one Twitter user wrote. "He's standing up for his mom, and I respect that." On the other side, the critics were relentless. "Another Trump puppet in the making," one comment read. "He's just doing what he's told, pretending to be this innocent little boy while secretly being groomed for political power." A number of articles began to surface, questioning Barron's motivations. Was this a simple act of familial loyalty, or was it part of a more calculated attempt to alter the public's perception of the Trump family? With the media already embroiled in the aftermath of Barron's actions, outlets began reporting that his appearance on CNN Tonight had been far from spontaneous. Sources close to the Trump family confirmed that Barron had been briefed ahead of time, receiving careful guidance on how to present his defense of his mother. The Trump family has always been strategic, one anonymous source told the New York Times. This wasn't a coincidence. Barron was given a platform and he used it well, but don't be fooled. There's a deeper play at work here. Days passed, and the frenzy surrounding Barron's words started to settle into a new kind of rhythm. The media buzzed with analysis, public opinion swirled, but things seemed quieter on the surface. Barron returned to his routine, avoiding the spotlight for the time being. He went to school, attended meetings, and continued his studies. But beneath the surface, there was a growing tension in the air, an undercurrent of anticipation, as if the next move was already being planned. Inside the Trump family's inner circle, things were far from quiet. Donald Trump's advisors were working overtime to shape Barron's public persona, ensuring that every step he took from here on out would be calculated and deliberate. Melania, though grateful for her son's defense, knew the world was watching, and now Barron was at the center of a media circus that could either make or break him. For Barron, it was a strange feeling. He had never desired the attention. In fact, he had always shied away from it. But as the days wore on, he began to understand something about the nature of power. It wasn't just about being seen, it was about being able to shape the conversation. And Barron had done that with a single quiet interruption. His actions had shifted the national discourse, and that, he realized, gave him a kind of power he hadn't known he possessed. It was a power that would continue to grow, and a power that the media, for all its speculation and scrutiny, could no longer ignore. The days following Barron Trump's dramatic intervention on CNN Tonight blurred together in a haze of media coverage, speculation, and backlash. Each day brought more reactions, some favorable, some scathing, but the ripple effect was undeniable. Barron, once a shadowy figure in the background of the Trump family's spectacle, had emerged as a powerful and unpredictable force. He had put the world on notice, and now the world was trying to figure out what to make of him. The Trump Tower, where Barron lived with his parents, felt different. The usual bustle of staff and advisors had a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. The hum of conversations, the rustle of papers, the quick footsteps in and out of rooms, it was all charged with an undercurrent of tension. There was something bigger at play now, something beyond just the Trump family. Barron's words had transcended the immediate event. They had sparked a political firestorm, and everyone was waiting for the next move. Inside the tower, Barron was alone in his room. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated the pages of a book, but his mind was far from the words on the pages. The phone in his pocket buzzed constantly, the notifications a constant reminder that his life had irrevocably changed. Every time he glanced at the screen, it was another mention, another headline, another post. But Barron didn't open them. Instead, he focused on the quiet rhythm of his thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened. He had no desire for fame. The public glare had always been something he tried to avoid, but the events of the past few days had pulled him into the very spotlight he had spent so long trying to stay out of. The world wanted to know more about Barron Trump, the quiet, reserved son of a larger-than-life family. People wanted to understand him, to decipher his motivations. But Barron wasn't ready to give them what they wanted. His parents, on the other hand, were far more attuned to the shifting winds. Donald Trump had always been a master of media manipulation, and now, with Barron at the center of this growing storm, he saw an opportunity. Barron had become something more than just a figurehead. He had become a symbol, a new face for the Trump legacy. The way he had defended Melania had resonated with a public that was tired of seeing the Trump family ridiculed. But Donald knew that Barron's move could either solidify their power or expose them to even greater scrutiny. The stakes were higher now. In the weeks that followed, Barron found himself embroiled in a game he had never asked to play. Every public appearance, every interview, every moment caught on camera now carried the weight of expectation. But Barron was methodical. Unlike his father, who thrived in the chaos of public battles, Barron knew how to wait. He understood that power wasn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. At school, Barron did his best to remain invisible. The teachers, aware of his sudden rise to fame, treated him with a strange mixture of respect and caution. His classmates, however, were a different story. Some were excited to be in the same school as Barron Trump. Others, more cynical, whispered behind his back. He was no longer just a kid at the desk in the back of the classroom. He was a public figure, a symbol of something much larger than himself. Barron could feel the shift. He could feel the eyes on him. But he had learned long ago to carry himself with an air of detachment, a skill honed over years of living under the relentless scrutiny of the media. As Barron retreated into the quiet routine of his life, the media continued to push for answers. They weren't satisfied with the headlines they already had. They needed more. They needed to know Barron's next move. On television, the pundits were still dissecting his appearance on CNN Tonight. The commentary was starting to take a more pointed tone. What was Barron's true intention? Asked one reporter on MSNBC. Was this a genuine act of defense for his mother, or was he simply playing his part in the Trump family's larger narrative? The questions were growing more invasive, more personal. The media wanted to know everything about Barron, the way he thought, the way he moved through the world, the way he interacted with his parents. He had stepped into the limelight, and now there was no way out. Every action he took, every decision he made, was under the microscope. A bombshell story broke one afternoon, alleging that Barron had been privately meeting with his father's political advisors and strategists. The report suggested that Barron's appearance on CNN had not been a spontaneous act of defiance, but rather a carefully planned move, part of a larger strategy to bolster the Trump family's image. The article claimed that Barron had been groomed for public life, that he was being positioned for a future role in the family's political machine. The report sent shockwaves through the media. Was Barron simply a pawn in his father's game? Had he been manipulated into making that speech? Or was he a willing participant in shaping the Trump family's future? Barron's response, however, was a study in silence. He didn't respond to the rumors, didn't make a statement. He remained quietly unaffected, allowing the story to unfold without his involvement. It was his way of letting the media work themselves into a frenzy while he held his ground. Barron understood one thing above all else. The more he stayed out of the spotlight, the more powerful he became. He was playing the long game. The weeks after Barron's televised defense of Melania unfolded like a slow-moving storm. The media, once clamoring for answers, seemed to grow more insistent, their questions growing sharper and more invasive. Barron Trump, whose name had been nothing more than an occasional footnote in news reports, was now a focal point of national attention. And the weight of that attention began to shift the balance in ways no one could have predicted. Barron, for all his silence, began to understand the enormity of his actions. His life had changed in an instant, and now every movement, every decision, carried consequences he had never fully grasped. The quiet teenager who had spent years out of the public eye was now inextricably tied to the narrative of his family, and that narrative was a complex, often brutal one. In the Trump family's world, this meant navigating a delicate balancing act. For Donald Trump, the shift in public perception was exactly what he had hoped for. His son's defiance of the media had turned Barron into a hero in the eyes of his supporters, a symbol of loyalty, strength, and resilience. It was a narrative Donald could work with. He could mold it, refine it, and use it to his advantage in the political landscape. But for Melania, it was more complicated. She had always been a figure of mystery, her actions and decisions frequently subjected to public scrutiny. Now, with Barron's defense of her, the media had turned their lens toward her once more. The attention was different this time. It was not just criticism or mockery, it was admiration. But the price of admiration was always steep. Melania knew this better than anyone. As the world began to focus more on Barron's words and actions, there was a mounting tension between the desire for visibility and the instinct to retreat. Barron had, in many ways, crossed an invisible line. He had publicly confronted the media, something few people dared to do, let alone a young boy who had always been in the background. And now that the media was paying attention, they were hungry for more. Barron spent his days in a strange limbo. He had his private moments, his moments of peace, when he could shut out the noise. But those moments were becoming increasingly rare. Even at school he could feel the eyes on him. His classmates, who had once seen him as just another student, now whispered about him in the halls. They wanted to know what it felt like to be Barron Trump, the son of a former president, the young man who had interrupted a live broadcast and defended his mother in front of the nation. But Barron didn't answer their questions. He kept his head down, focused on his studies. He tried to be as normal as he could in a world that had suddenly made him anything but. Despite the attention, he still believed that silence was a form of power. And if he stayed quiet long enough, the media would move on to something else. It was what his father had taught him in the most subtle of ways. Let the world chase after you, but never let them catch you. Yet even as Barron tried to maintain his quiet resistance, his father's influence loomed large. Donald, never one to shy away from the spotlight, found ways to bring Barron into the fold. There were meetings with political advisors, private discussions about strategy, and, at times, careful orchestrations of Barron's public appearances. Though Barron remained largely absent from the media's grasp, Donald made sure to plant the seeds for his son's future. Barron had already proven himself capable of taking the stage when needed, and now Donald was ready to use that. As days turned into weeks, the media frenzy surrounding Barron only intensified. Every minor detail of his life was dissected. He was seen walking into the family's private building, and the headlines followed. Barron Trump spotted with his father. Is he being groomed for politics? Read one headline from the New York Times. Barron's quiet move, what does he really want? Asked the Washington Post. Each day brought new questions, new angles, new theories. The media was like a hound on the scent of something it couldn't quite catch. They needed to understand Barron, to label him, to fit him into a narrative they could control. But Barron was a mystery to them. He wasn't the outspoken, larger-than-life figure his father was. He didn't engage with the media in the same way his mother did. And perhaps that was what fascinated the media most of all, Barron's resistance to being shaped by their lens. The more the media chased him, the more elusive he became. He wasn't interested in their stories, and yet they couldn't stop writing about him. One evening, as the night's shadows began to stretch across the windows of Trump Tower, Barron sat in his room, his fingers tracing the edges of a book he hadn't touched in days. The phone buzzed again, the latest message from his father. "You did well. People are noticing. Keep your head down for now, but we'll be ready when the time comes. Stay sharp." Barron didn't respond. Instead, he set the phone down and leaned back against his chair, staring out the window. He could see the lights of the city flickering below, the endless rows of buildings and streets that stretched beyond his view. It was a world that seemed both close and distant. A world he had once observed from the outside, but now felt inexplicably part of. He had become a part of something bigger than himself. The moment he stepped into the public eye, he had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. Barron understood that now, but he didn't know where this path would lead him. He didn't know what role he was supposed to play in the larger drama of his family's political future. For the first time, Barron felt the weight of the choices ahead of him. His father was a force of nature, driven by ambition and the need for power. His mother, while quieter, had her own subtle influence, one that shaped everything she touched. Barron, however, was different. He wasn't motivated by the same hunger for attention, the same need for validation. He wanted something more elusive, something he hadn't yet fully defined. As he stared out into the night, Barron made a decision. He would play the long game. He would remain the enigma, the figure in the background, while the world around him continued to spin. He would let the media chase after him. But in the end, it would be Barron who chose when the moment was right. It would be Barron who decided what story he wanted to tell. And as the city lights below flickered on, Barron Trump knew that he was no longer just a passive player in his family's saga. He was the quiet architect of his own narrative. The question now was how long he could keep that control. The days that followed Barron Trump's unexpected entrance into the public spotlight were not marked by any dramatic immediate shifts. Instead, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of his life. The media's obsessive gaze lingered on him, but he had learned how to remain still, how to disappear into the background even when the world was looking. Barron had come to realize that he didn't need to engage with the noise in order to influence it. And that, more than anything, was what set him apart from the rest of his family. At school, the noise had not subsided. Barron's classmates, while respectful, had become more curious, more eager to gain some insight into his life. But Barron, always the observer, never gave them more than what they expected. He remained distant, a quiet figure who walked through the hallways without drawing unnecessary attention. He was acutely aware of the shifting dynamics around him, the unspoken questions in the eyes of his peers, but he kept his distance, letting them wonder. In his private moments, Barron reflected on what had happened. It was impossible not to, of course. The national conversation had taken a sharp turn the moment he spoke those words on CNN. But as the days wore on, Barron began to sense something darker. He had once enjoyed the comfort of anonymity, the freedom that came with being an unknown figure, a silent observer in the background. But now he was part of a much larger narrative, a narrative that he hadn't written but had unwittingly been swept into. The expectations placed upon him, both from his family and the public, were overwhelming. They wanted more of him. They wanted to know what he would do next, what role he would play. His father had been clear in his private conversations. "You've got potential, Barron. Don't waste it. The world's watching, and it's yours to take." Donald's words, while undoubtedly meant to inspire, carried a weight that Barron wasn't sure he was ready to carry. He had never wanted to step into the spotlight. His desire had always been to remain in the shadows, observing the world from a distance. But now it seemed the world had decided for him. The pressure was becoming too much to ignore, and it was slowly eating away at the calm, controlled persona Barron had so carefully cultivated. Then came the event that would change everything, the first real test of Barron's ability to navigate the world that had been thrust upon him. It was a simple gala, a fundraiser for a cause his mother had supported for years, but it became a spectacle the moment Barron stepped into the room. Photographers swarmed, lights flashed, and reporters lined up to capture every moment. Barron, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed too formal for his age, felt a sharp, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. The walls seemed to close in around him, and for the first time since CNN Tonight, he began to question what he had gotten himself into. The gala was meant to be a celebration of charity, but it quickly turned into a media circus. As Barron entered the venue with his mother, the flashing cameras were relentless. He had been prepared for this, at least in theory. His parents had trained him in the art of managing public appearances, teaching him how to smile for the cameras, how to maintain an air of composure, even when the world was watching. But as he stood there, with the weight of the world's gaze upon him, Barron felt a surge of something he hadn't expected: anxiety. The noise of the flashing cameras and the murmured conversations of the crowd felt deafening. He stood next to Melania, who, as always, appeared perfectly composed, her face serene, her smile practiced but genuine. But Barron could sense her discomfort beneath the surface, a quiet unease in the way she held herself. She had lived under the weight of public scrutiny for years, and yet Barron, who had spent much of his life away from the spotlight, felt unprepared for this level of attention. As the evening wore on, Barron found himself retreating into the background. He He stayed close to his mother, watching as she navigated the crowd with her usual grace. She spoke with various dignitaries and donors, but Barron could feel the undercurrent of tension in the room, the weight of expectations pressing down on her. And as he observed, something clicked in Barron's mind, something he hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just about the media. This wasn't just about the public's fascination with his family. It was about control, the control they exerted over every part of their lives, their image and their future. The media had moved on from the gala, at least for now, but the question still hung in the air, unresolved. What was Barron Trump going to do next? Every day, new articles were published, new rumors circulated. The speculation about his future, his role in his family's political empire, grew louder. The public seemed to want an answer, but Barron wasn't ready to give it to them. In the quiet of Trump Tower, Barron spent his evenings alone in his room, away from the noise. He read, he wrote, and he thought. He found comfort in the solitude, in the hours he could spend away from the cameras and the questions. It was a reprieve, a break from the relentless pressure to conform to the narrative the world had built for him. But even in those moments of quiet, Barron knew something had changed. He was no longer just a boy living in the background of his family's legacy. He was a player in a much larger game, a game that had no clear rules, no clear end. His father, Donald, had been busy with his own affairs, navigating the political landscape with his usual flair. He had made it clear that Barron's future was his to shape, but he also made it clear that Barron was expected to play his part. "The family's success depends on all of us," Donald had told him on one occasion. "You're a part of this, Barron. Don't forget that." Melania, ever the quiet presence in Barron's life, had remained supportive. She had always been the one to offer him space, to let him figure things out on his own. But even Melania, who had dealt with her own public image for years, couldn't hide the concern in her eyes when she spoke to him. "It's hard, I know," she had said, her voice soft but steady. "But you don't have to be anything you're not." Barron wasn't sure what he was supposed to be. He wasn't like his father, with his brash confidence and bold actions. He wasn't like his mother, whose quiet strength had earned her a place in the world's gaze. Barron didn't crave the spotlight, but at the same time, he couldn't escape it. The more he tried to remain out of the public eye, the more the world seemed determined to pull him in. It was late one evening when Barron reached his breaking point. He had just finished reading another article about his family's political future. The headline was the same as so many others: Barron Trump's role in the future of the Trump dynasty. The article speculated on his potential involvement in future political campaigns, his possible run for office, his place in the world that had been carved out for him by his family and the media. Barron tossed the magazine aside in frustration. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to be molded into a symbol of something larger than himself. But the more he pushed back, the more the world pushed forward. The media, his family, and even his own internal expectations seemed to be forcing him into a box he wasn't sure he wanted to occupy. That night, Barron made a decision. He would no longer be a passive participant in the narrative. He would choose his own path, even if that path led him away from everything he knew. The pressure to conform, to become the person everyone expected him to be, was too great. It was time to take control of his story. A few weeks later, Barron made a public statement that would send shockwaves through the media. He appeared at a press conference alongside his mother, Melania, who stood by him as always. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones raised. Barron stood in front of the crowd, calm and composed, his posture straight, his expression serious. "Thank you for your time," Barron began, his voice steady but clear. "I know there has been a lot of speculation about my future, about my role in my family's legacy. I want to make one thing very clear. I am not defined by anyone else's expectations. I will not follow a path simply because it's the one that's been laid out for me. I will choose my own direction, and I will live my life on my terms." The room went silent. The reporters exchanged looks, uncertain of how to process Barron's words. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't the Barron Trump the media had created. This was something new, something different. A young man who had chosen to step away from the spotlight, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. "I respect my family's legacy," Barron continued, his eyes focused on the crowd. "But I am not my father, and I am not my mother. I am my own person, and I will make my own decisions. I ask for the same respect that anyone else would deserve, to live my life freely without being defined by what others want me to be." The response to Barron's statement was immediate and intense. Some praised him for his courage, for taking control of his own narrative in a world that was so eager to define him. Others, however, questioned his motives. Was this an act of rebellion? Was he distancing himself from the family legacy? The media storm that followed was unlike anything Barron had experienced before. But this time, he was ready. He had taken control, and in doing so, he had shattered the expectations that had once bound him. Donald Trump, ever the strategist, issued a statement of his own. "Barron is a smart young man," he said. "He has the potential to do anything he sets his mind to. We support him, no matter what path he chooses." Melania, who had always been Barron's quiet support, smiled softly when asked about her son's decision. "I have always encouraged Barron to follow his heart," she said. "He knows who he is, and that's all I've ever wanted for him." For Barron, the months that followed were marked by a newfound sense of freedom. He no longer felt the weight of the media's expectations, the pressure to be someone he wasn't. He didn't know exactly where his path would lead, but for the first time, Barron felt the power to choose for himself. And in that quiet, personal moment of clarity, he realized something profound. It wasn't about escaping his family's legacy. It was about defining his own,